Hello and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. China's maneuvering. How are China's fortunes faring during the global financial crisis, the Eurozone fiasco, political uncertainty in the U.S., and the Arab Spring? Is China a net gainer as the world undergoes massive economic and geopolitical shifts? And as the world changes, will China take on a greater leadership role? To crosstalk China's growing influence, I'm joined by Greg Audrey in Irvine. He's an entrepreneur and co-author of Death by China. In Miami, we have Oded Shenkar. He is the Ford Motor Company Chair in Global Business Management at Ohio State University. And in Beijing, we cross to Doris Nesbitt. She is the director of the Nesbitt China Institute. All right, folks, you have different points of view on this, and I want you to show my viewers, okay? But first, Masha, people say that China is set to save the world.
Well, I don't know about that, but there is little doubt that over the last decade, Asia, and China specifically, has been steadily moving to the fore of the global economy. And in the wake of the 2008 credit crunch, which shattered the Western financial parthenon and triggered Europe's own sovereign debt crisis, experts say China's role and power in global affairs is more palpable than ever. Growing economic might is reflected in recent talk over Beijing's capacity to contribute to the Eurozone's bailout fund. The decision has not been finalized, but European leaders and the IMF have all welcomed the prospect of an investment which could range between $50 and $100 billion.
I believe a proper resolution for European debt is very important for stability of finance, trade and economy.
If China does inject cash into the Eurozone, it would mark an unprecedented shift in global power dynamics and make China a financial power on par with the US. But this wouldn't be the first time that the two countries jousted. For a while now, the US has laid claims that China is undervaluing its currency.
They continue to try to game the system to their advantage and our disadvantage. So I think it's appropriate and fitting and timely for us to be standing up and saying, you know, this is not acceptable.
Ultimately, however, saving the Eurozone and the US is in China's own economic interests. Meanwhile, economists are already warning of contagion threat if the crisis unravels, and some have pointed to the country's slowed growth as a sign of a spillover effect, concerns that Beijing has dismissed.
Our overall evaluation is that in the past 3 quarters, it is safe to say that the national economy is generally on the right track and is benefiting from our macro control policies.
On the domestic front, China has been further tightening the screws on internet freedom. Whether it's a sign of its internal vulnerability amid worldwide popular uprisings is unclear. But a 3-day media conference last week ended with a whole slew of measures aimed at stopping what the Chinese call the spread of harmful information. But irrespective, it seems like China is going to go its way.
Well, let's talk about which way it's going to go. Odin in Miami, if I can go to you first here. I mean, what's most topical right now is whether the Chinese will bail out the Europeans, bail out the Eurozone. If they do, what would they get out of it?
Well, first of all, I think that the rise of China has been unfolding fairly quickly. In my book, The Chinese Century, about 6-7 years ago, I predicted that China will become world's largest economy in 2025, and we are midway through that process. So this is not entirely unpredictable. I mean, we have both the United States and Europe that are really mired in mountain of debt. There are only 2 countries out there that have the resources to help them out. One is Japan, which has also been a somewhat reluctant global player with a lot of domestic issues to solve. And then, of course, China. You have that amount of trillions of reserves where others are sinking deeper into the debt hole. This was, I think, quite predictable.
Okay. Greg, if I can go to you in Irvine, I mean, the Chinese have been very hesitant because they see that the Europeans just can't get their house in order. They've created such a utter mess of their economies with this debt crisis here. Why would the Chinese want to get in there and will we see the euro fail a half year from now?
Yeah, first of all, we've got to be clear, when the Chinese loan money to America or to Europe, it's not because they like them. It's merely to gain political advantage. For future economic exploitation.
Well, like every other country does. Is that different than other countries do? I mean, every country goes after self-interest, right? And geopolitical interest as well.
nowhere near as cunning and strategic as China does. And we've got to be clear that funding our moral hazard and keeping us behaving badly either in Europe or the United States is not in China's long-term best interests either. It's only China wanting to see the West continue to harm itself.
Doris, you wanted to jump in there? Go right ahead.
Well, yes, I was just going to say, who sets the measure? I mean, who decides what's good and bad behavior? You know, I think we're at a point where the West has to think about who decides what's good and bad. Are we really in the position, given all the problems we have, to just talk top down to China and say what we decide is good and what we think is good and what you do is bad? I think that the approach would much more be, what can we do together to solve the problems?
Okay, Greg, do you want to reply to that? Do you think that who decides the measure? Very good question.
Yeah, well, you know, that moral equivalency argument's really interesting until you come to face somebody who's truly evil. We went through this whole same argument in the 1930s, don't criticize the Germans. A lot of American companies went over there and set up business and said it's not our position to say how they treat their borders.
You're equating China of today to Nazi Germany of the 1930s?
Absolutely, although I think, you know, China's some way worse as far as volume of scale and the level of censorship that's happening internally there. But clearly the repression they put on their own people is actually execute honestly, more than the rest of the world put together. These are absolute objective moral values.
All right, let's go to Oded in Miami. Go ahead.
No, I vehemently object. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, equate the two together. You know, Nazi Germany is on a completely different level. I mean, you know, a country that has been probably the worst atrocity that we have witnessed in human civilization. So with all respect, I mean, I would not put China there.
The Chinese Communist Party has killed more people than any other totalitarian regime in history.
Doris, you want to reply to that here?
Very well documented.
Go ahead,
yes,
Doris. Go ahead,
yes,
jump in.
Absolutely. You know, you open your book, Mr. Audrey, with quoting with a mark to Tiananmen Square. That was in 1989. I don't know when you have been to China for the last time, and I don't know with how many Chinese people you have been talking. You know, we have you gotta take the frame of the Chinese people and not go, well, you know, we are in China right now, and we have been talking last week with people of Chengdu, where they really try and work on urban-rural integration to get people into an economic growth, the rural population. The young people are going with each other via internet. It's not that there is no communication. The internet certainly can be called the second party in China, and it's certainly certain things are regulated, yes, without doubt. But China is in the process